When we think of ancient sieges, we think of armies, walls breached, empires falling, victors writing history. But inside every city that fell, there were women, thousands of them, mothers, daughters, wives. They had names, they had lives, and when the gates finally broke, they were still there. History recorded the date, it recorded the general, it recorded how many soldiers died, but it never wrote down what happened to them. Not because it didn't happen, but because no one thought their story mattered enough to tell. This pattern repeated across centuries, across continents, in every siege, every conquest, every glorious victory. The women were always there. So if this happened everywhere, in every war we celebrate, in every empire we study, why have we never heard their names?
Before the walls fell, there was waiting. Girls were told to stay inside, to remain quiet, to trust the stone, the men, the rules that had always existed. During a siege, families believed danger lived outside the city. They believed protection had a shape: walls, fathers, brothers, laws. They believed youth was something to be guarded. But when the breach came, protection did not fail slowly. It ended instantly. What followed was not chaos, it was order. Ancient sources rarely describe it in detail, but they all assume it. Once a city was taken, certain lives became available, not randomly, not equally. Young women were noticed first, not because they were weak, but because they were valuable. Age mattered, marital status mattered. Bodies were assessed the way land or livestock had always been assessed, for future use. History often describes this moment with a single word: taken, as if that word were neutral, as if it explained anything. But being taken was not an accident of war, it was an expectation. Across civilizations, armies entered cities knowing exactly what they were allowed to claim, and young women, especially unmarried ones, were considered unclaimed property the moment the walls fell. Their fathers could no longer object. Their brothers could no longer intervene. Marriage contracts, dowries, customs, all of it dissolved in the same instant the gates gave way. Law did not collapse, it simply changed hands. What replaced protection was entitlement. Girls who had never left their neighborhoods were suddenly exposed to a world where familiarity meant nothing, names meant nothing, plea meant nothing. Youth, once a promise, became a liability. History rarely records resistance here, not because it didn't exist, but because resistance was irrelevant to the outcome. This was not about emotion, it was about sorting. Those deemed too young were separated. Those deemed suitable were claimed. Those deemed inconvenient disappeared from the record entirely. And this pattern repeats. In Mesopotamia, in Greece, in Rome, in China, in medieval Europe, different languages, different gods, same result. This is one of the most unsettling truths of ancient warfare. Everyone knew what would happen next. The girls inside the city knew. Their families knew. The soldiers knew. That knowledge hung in the air long before the first stone was thrown. During sieges that lasted months, sometimes years, fear was not focused on starvation or disease alone. It was focused on survival afterward. Because surrender did not guarantee safety, it only guaranteed access. When chroniclers describe cities being spared, they often mean buildings were left standing. They do not mean lives were. And when they speak of mercy, they rarely define who received it. For young women, mercy was never the point. Once taken, identity became flexible. Languages were lost, names were changed, lineages were rewritten. Some were absorbed into households far from their birthplace. Some were exchanged. Some were never mentioned again. History does not follow them. Instead, it moves on to the next campaign, the next general, the next victory. This absence is not because their experiences were rare, it is because they were routine. So routine that no explanation seemed necessary. So expected that silence became the record. And that may be the most disturbing part of all. Not that this happened, but that it happened so often, across so many centuries, that history stopped noticing. The youngest were not spared. They were the first taken.
Before the walls fell, many women were already grieving. Sieges did not only kill with swords, they killed with time. Husbands were lost to disease, sons were taken by hunger, fathers collapsed under exhaustion long before the gates were breached. By the time the city fell, many women were already widows, not by ritual, not by burial, but by absence. For mothers and pregnant women, the siege stripped away something ancient and unspoken, the assumption that someone else would stand between them and harm. In most ancient societies, protection was not abstract, it was male. It was embodied in husbands, brothers, grown sons, and kin networks that enforced limits. When those figures disappeared, womanhood itself was redefined. Survival stopped being a right, it became a negotiation. And negotiations always favor the powerful. Mothers were no longer seen first as caretakers, they were seen as liabilities or leverage. Children cried during the final days of a siege, not from fear, but from hunger. Those cries did not stop when the walls fell. They became more dangerous. A crying child revealed presence. A child clinging to a mother revealed attachment. Attachment could be exploited. For many women, the moment of capture was not singular. It unfolded over days. First came uncertainty, then separation. Children were pulled from arms, older sons were dragged away, infants were weighed against inconvenience. History often compresses this into one phrase: the city was taken. But for mothers, the taking was granular, piece by piece. Pregnant women occupied a particularly cruel position. Their bodies carried futures that no longer belonged to them. In ancient warfare, pregnancy did not guarantee protection. It often intensified vulnerability. A pregnant body represented continuity, and conquerors understood the power of controlling it. Some pregnancies were ignored, some were exploited, some were erased from the record entirely. What remained was fear layered upon fear. Fear for oneself, fear for the unborn, fear for the children already breathing. Motherhood, once an anchor of identity, became a weakness that could be threatened. And threats did not need to be spoken. They were understood. Widows experienced a different kind of collapse. Without a husband's name, women lost more than companionship. They lost legal recognition. Property rights dissolved. Inheritance claims vanished. Protection evaporated. A widow was not just a woman without a spouse. She was a woman without standing. In many conquered cities, widows were categorized as unattached, which made them accessible. Not protected by marriage, not shielded by alliance, just present. And presence was enough. What followed was dependency. Food was no longer communal. Shelter was no longer inherited. Safety was no longer implicit. Everything had to be requested, and requests had a price. Women learned quickly which forms of resistance endangered their children, which silences kept them fed, which compliance kept families intact, or partially intact. Survival was measured in concessions. This is where history becomes quiet, because negotiations leave few records. What is recorded are outcomes, marriages, households, populations absorbed into new empires. What is not recorded is the cost. The moments when a woman chose between hunger and submission, between her dignity and her child's life, between speaking and surviving. Pause here, because this is where many modern narratives break down. We are taught to admire resilience, to praise endurance, but endurance under coercion is not heroism. It is calculation, and calculation under threat is not consent. Families collapsed in ways history struggles to describe. Children raised in households where their mothers' pasts were erased, siblings separated across borders, names replaced with new languages, new gods, new loyalties. For mothers, survival often meant disappearance. They lived on, but not as themselves, not as they had been known. They became wives again, or servants, or shadows within households that did not ask where they came from. And their children grew up without knowing the full truth, sometimes by design, sometimes by necessity. There is a reason ancient sources speak vaguely about women remaining. Remaining where? Remaining as what? Remaining meant being absorbed into a system that had no interest in their story. Remaining meant being useful. The emotional toll of this kind of survival is almost entirely absent from the historical record. We do not hear about the nights, the memories that returned without warning, the grief that had no language. We do not hear about women who survived the siege but never recovered themselves, because history prefers outcomes to interiors. It prefers stability to suffering. Pause again. Ask yourself, what does survival mean if it requires erasure? For many mothers, the most painful loss was not death, it was transformation. Children who survived grew up altered. They spoke different languages. They called different men father. And mothers learned to stay silent, because silence kept families together, or at least prevented further loss. This silence is not evidence of peace. It is evidence of constraint. Ancient societies often framed post-siege absorption as mercy. Cities spared, populations resettled, order restored. But mercy that requires submission is not mercy, and order that relies on dependency is not justice. Mothers and widows lived at the intersection of survival and surrender. They did not choose freely. They chose carefully. Every day after the siege was a calculation: what to say, what to hide, what to endure. And when we read history, we rarely ask what endurance cost, because the women who survived had no monuments, no triumphs, no epics, only continuity. And continuity for history is easy to overlook. Grief narrated long after an event does not scream. It settles. It becomes heavy, unresolved. And that is how the suffering of mothers and widows remains with us, not as spectacle, but as a weight history never lifted. They survived, but survival came without protection, without choice, and without a voice that history was willing to keep.
Status was supposed to mean safety. For centuries, rank had functioned as a shield. Noble birth promised protection. Sacred office implied restraint. Marriage into power suggested immunity from the chaos that consumed ordinary lives. When cities were threatened, elite women were often told to remain calm. Negotiations were underway. Ransoms would be paid. Honor would prevail. This belief did not survive the fall of the walls. Because in siege warfare, status did not protect women, it redefined their use. Queens, noble wives, and priestesses were never invisible. They were known quantities. Their names carried political weight. Their bodies carried symbolic value. Their survival, or humiliation, could stabilize or destabilize entire regions. When a city fell, elite women were not lost in the crowd. They were identified, quickly, not as civilians, but as assets. Ancient warfare operated on calculation, not impulse. Conquerors understood that controlling elite women meant controlling narratives, lineages, alliances, legitimacy. A captured queen was not simply a prisoner, she was leverage. A noblewoman was not simply defeated, she was transferable. Forced marriages were not acts of personal desire, they were administrative decisions. By marrying elite women into conquering families, victors rewrote bloodlines. They turned conquest into continuity, occupation into inheritance. History often frames these unions as pragmatic solutions, as stabilizing measures. But stabilization came at a cost that is rarely named. Priestesses occupied an especially precarious position. Their authority was spiritual, not martial. Their power derived from belief, not force. And belief collapses quickly under conquest. To dominate a city fully, conquerors had to desacralize it. Temples were stripped, rituals were interrupted, sacred women were made ordinary, or worse, made examples. This was not accidental. Public humiliation of religious women signaled a deeper message. The old gods no longer ruled here. Honor was not broken in private, it was dismantled in full view. Elite wives faced another illusion, marriage as protection. Marriage contracts were respected only as long as the system enforcing them survived. When that system fell, marriage became irrelevant. Husbands who died defending cities took their authority with them. Those who survived had no leverage to enforce old agreements. Elite women were suddenly unanchored, still valuable, still visible, but no longer protected. What followed was not chaos, it was process. Hostage-taking became routine. Women were moved deliberately, often carefully, not harmed indiscriminately, but repurposed strategically. A noblewoman placed in the wrong household could incite rebellion. Placed in the right one, she could pacify it. Her presence alone could legitimize rule. This is why elite women were watched so closely, why their movements were recorded when others were erased. Visibility did not equal safety. It meant surveillance. History sometimes portrays restraint toward elite women as mercy, but restraint is not respect. Being kept alive for value is not protection, it is calculation, and calculation is colder than violence. Public humiliation served a specific function, to show that no rank was immune, to demonstrate that old hierarchies were finished. Elite women who had once embodied dignity were displayed as evidence of defeat. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was messaging. The conquered population needed to see that if the highest could fall, no one remained protected. The myth of honor in conquest relies heavily on selective memory. Chroniclers praise restraint when elite women were not killed. They call it civilization. But survival under domination is not honor, and preservation of life without preservation of autonomy is not mercy. Consider how often history praises conquerors for sparing noblewomen. What does sparing mean here? It means they were not executed. It does not mean they were free. It does not mean their futures remained their own. Expectation and outcome rarely aligned. Women raised to believe in lineage discovered lineage could be rewritten. Women taught to trust in sacred roles learned sanctity could be stripped. Women who embodied alliances became tools to forge new ones. The fall was not only physical, it was symbolic. Status collapsed inward. This is where romantic narratives falter. They imagine elite women negotiating from strength, influencing outcomes, softening conquerors. Sometimes this happened. Often it did not. Influence is not power when refusal is impossible. And adaptation is not agency when alternatives are lethal. The disturbing truth is simple. Power did not shield these women, it priced them. Their value made them central to conquest, not exempt from it. They were preserved because they were useful, moved because they were meaningful, displayed because they were symbolic, and history mistook this for protection. In the end, status failed in the same way walls failed. It looked solid, it inspired confidence, it collapsed the moment force replaced tradition. The Romantic myth tells us conquest respected rank. The record tells us something colder. Conquest understood rank perfectly, and it used it.
Submission was a choice, but it was not freedom. Resistance was a choice, but it was not safety. Suicide was a choice, but it was not escape. Every option was measured in loss. Every path carried consequences no one outside the city could imagine. After the walls fell, the women inside faced not chaos, but calculation. Their captors understood the limits of choice. They understood the cost of defiance. They understood that survival itself could be weaponized. Submission became a language, a slow, deliberate negotiation with circumstance. To comply was to live. To resist was to invite ruin. To take one's own life was to reclaim a fragment of control that history had stripped away. These were not acts of heroism, they were acts of endurance, measured, deliberate, unbearable endurance. The first path, submission, demanded adaptation. To survive, a woman might comply with rules she never accepted. She might move into a household that was not hers, follow rituals that were alien, learn a language she did not speak. Every day was a lesson in compromise, every action a quiet calculation. Which concession kept my child fed? Which silence kept me safe? Which compliance preserved the life of someone I loved? Submission did not grant autonomy, it granted only continued existence. And existence, when stripped of choice, becomes a burden. Resistance, the second path, was rarely recorded, not because it was absent, but because it failed to survive the telling. A woman could refuse to obey, refuse to move, refuse to comply. She could defy her captors in the smallest ways, through words or gestures, through refusal to accept new names or new allegiances. Resistance was punished swiftly. It was measured, deliberate, and public. Even minor defiance could destabilize the fragile order imposed after the siege. Yet, despite the consequences, some resisted. History has almost no record of them, only implication, only absence. The audience may imagine strength here, a heroic act in the face of domination, but survival does not reward courage when punishment is certainty. And even when the body remained, the spirit could be confined. The third path, suicide, was rarely chosen, but always understood. It was an act of reclamation, a momentary return of agency when all other avenues were closed. Death in these circumstances was not tragedy in the narrative sense, it was clarity, a declaration that control could still exist, even if only in the final moment. It was also profoundly lonely, a choice that left no witness, no chronicler, no story except for silence itself. And perhaps that silence is why we feel its weight today, because we cannot measure the magnitude of agency reclaimed in darkness, because we do not hear the names of those who chose death rather than submission. The three paths do not form a spectrum from good to bad. They do not offer moral absolutes. There is no heroism here, only varying shades of loss. Every act, compliance, defiance, or self-determination carried consequences. Every act was constrained by circumstance. Every decision was made under threat that was immediate, tangible, and absolute. Pause. Consider what we mean by choice. Does the ability to act when all options are lethal qualify as freedom? Does endurance under coercion deserve praise or simply recognition?
Can we admire survival when survival itself demands surrender? The women who submitted often did so for family. They navigated new households, learned new customs, tended to children who were no longer wholly theirs. They were living, but living was only partially their own. Those who resisted endured punishment meant to teach lessons, not to individuals, but to all who observed. Resistance became a warning, a demonstration that defiance could be contained, that autonomy was negotiable, never absolute. And those who chose death reclaimed autonomy in a world designed to deny it. But death cannot preserve the past. It cannot restore names erased. It cannot protect the children left behind. The psychological weight of these choices is invisible to history. Chronicles focus on the city, the army, the victory. They seldom dwell on the decisions imposed upon women. And when they do, they often mislabel them as obedience or virtue, defiance or folly. We are left to imagine the quiet terror of standing in a house no longer your own, the tremor of uncertainty with every knock at the door, the constant calculation, who must I serve today? Which words must I speak to survive? Which silences must I maintain? Imagine the burden of motherhood under these conditions. Every child a reason to endure, every day a negotiation, every breath a debt paid to circumstance. Pause. We are accustomed to measuring strength by action, but what of strength measured by restraint, by calculation, by survival itself? The women of these sieges redefine it. Strength was not defiance, it was endurance, it was adaptability, it was the ability to continue living when the world demanded submission. Yet endurance does not grant freedom, it grants only continuation. And in that continuation lies an invisible cost. Some women navigated their captors with skill, leveraging knowledge, beauty, alliances, or charm. Others were silent, waiting for opportunities that never arrived. Still others chose disappearance, surrendering to death before the world could impose its will. The outcome did not distinguish courage from fear. It distinguished those whose bodies survived from those whose stories survived. Pause. Every day was a microcosm of the siege itself, a negotiation between vulnerability and endurance, between threat and strategy, between life and the cost of living. History rarely acknowledges these choices. It records victories and defeats. It records walls and gates, banners and generals. It records treaties and ransoms. It rarely records the women who endured, the calculations they made, the costs they bore. And yet these decisions shaped the world. Children grew, alliances shifted, families persisted or disappeared. Their choices, constrained as they were, determined outcomes in ways history cannot trace. Pause. What do we mean when we speak of survival? Is it enough to live if life demands surrender? Is strength to endure when every act carries consequence? Can there be honor when survival itself is imposed by force? These are not easy answers. They are questions we are left to sit with long after the walls fell, long after the siege ended, long after history moved on. For centuries, these women lived in shadow. Some adapted, some resisted, some vanished. All carried the cost of decisions that no one else could make for them. Every day was a balance of threat and calculation. Every choice exacted a price. Every path demanded loss. There was no heroic option. There was no moral victory. Only survival measured against the weight of surrender. Pause. We tend to admire survival when it is easy to understand, when courage is visible, when victory is public. But the survival of these women was private. It was uncelebrated. It was imposed. It was measured in endurance, not in triumph. And in that silence, the full cost of siege warfare becomes clear. Enduring through coercion is not heroism, it is persistence. It is a form of quiet resistance sometimes. It is the survival of the body when the mind, the identity, and the agency are constrained. Yet it is unforgettable, because it forces us to reconsider what strength truly means. It forces us to confront a past that is as precise as it is cruel. It forces us to feel the weight of decisions no one should have to make. Silence settles here. Submission, resistance, disappearance, none are absolutes, none are victories, all are loss. And history, the history that chronicles walls and generals, does not acknowledge the depth of that loss. It never has. But it lingers, in quiet memory, in unrecorded suffering, in the invisible paths women walked while empires celebrated conquest. Their choices, constrained as they were, echo across centuries, quietly, unseen, unforgiven. And that is the weight of survival after capture.
History is written by those who survive to tell it. But survival alone does not guarantee truth. It guarantees perspective. And perspective is rarely neutral. The voices of women taken during sieges were rarely preserved, not because they were unimportant, but because the world that recorded history did not wish to hear them. Male scribes, chroniclers, and victors shaped the record. They measured cities by walls, by banners, by gold. They recorded who conquered whom, who died in battle, who signed treaties. Women's suffering was incidental, their endurance invisible, their loss sanitized. Shame has a quiet voice. A survivor's shame inherited through generations made confession dangerous. Naming abusers was often impossible. Speaking of coercion, humiliation, or captivity could bring further reprisal. Silence became a shield, and in that silence, history found convenience. The chroniclers of empires wrote in ways that obscured the human cost. Taken became neutral, captured became procedural, absorbed erased individuality. Victims became footnotes, loss became acceptable collateral, suffering became invisible. By recording victories and celebrating conquest, history preserved triumph while burying tragedy. Walls that fell, armies that marched, treaties signed, these were legible. The lives of women who endured, adapted, resisted, or disappeared, these were illegible. Their absence is not silence, it is design. Sieges were not neutral events, they were gendered catastrophes. Destruction did not fall evenly. Women's bodies, roles, and futures were systematically recalculated, measured, and absorbed into the logic of conquest. History has often obscured this calculus, but the truth remains. Sieges did more than topple cities, they dismantled lives along invisible lines of gender. The omission of women from chronicles is itself a statement. It declares that some lives were expendable, some suffering irrelevant, some endurance unworthy of record. And yet, absence is not nothing. It is a weight. It is a pattern. It is a quiet crime that echoes through centuries. Our responsibility today is not to judge with modern morality. It is not to rewrite the past for comfort. It is to remember. To name what history left unnamed, to hold attention where it was denied, to listen when the record is silent. Because remembrance is resistance, because recognition restores what omission erased, because truth survives in the act of telling, even centuries later. Pause. Imagine the countless women whose names were never recorded. Imagine the countless children whose lineage was rewritten. Imagine the weight of lives reduced to absence. They were not collateral. They were not incidental. They were the center of a catastrophe disguised as history. So when we study sieges, let us not only count the walls that fell, or the generals who triumphed, or the treaties that followed. Let us count the women whose stories were erased. Let us acknowledge the silence imposed on them. Let us recognize that every conquest was also a calculated erasure. History may never tell their names. It may never grant them space in textbooks, in monuments, in epics. But their absence carries a lesson, a weight, a truth that lingers. Listen closely. Even when history is silent, the echoes remain. And in those echoes, the women taken, the mothers lost, the daughters claimed, they are always present. Always. They were always there. And we, at last, must bear witness.